Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Tensions between China and Japan are rapidly escalating, from sharp diplomatic exchanges to direct military friction. Japan claims a Chinese jet locked its radar onto one of its fighters, a charge Beijing denies, but fears of accidental conflict are rising. The dispute, triggered by Japan's remarks on a Taiwan contingency, has already led to travel advisories, cultural boycotts, and mounting economic concerns. So with President Lee Jae Myung eyeing visits to both countries next year and the Dokdo issue once again surfacing, questions are growing over how South Korea can steer a steady course and perhaps play a stabilizing role. For more on this, we connect to Han-na Kim, an associate professor at Sogang University's GSIS. A big welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And also, we're joined by Daniel Connolly, an associate professor of international relations at Korea University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's begin our discussion with Professor Kim from how everything has started. So Japan's Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi's comments about a possible Taiwan contingency. And now the friction seems to be spilling over from the economic and cultural spheres into military tensions as well. How do you assess the current state of the China-Japan conflict, Professor?
I think the current tension between China and Japan has entered somewhat of a dangerous phase at this point. This is because diplomatic friction risks spilling over into heightened military confrontation, as you mentioned. Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi stated in the Diet that a contingency involving Taiwan could pose an existential threat to Japan. So this goes beyond Tokyo's usual strategic ambiguity on Taiwan. And she further suggests that Japan might consider military involvement if necessary. So of course, Beijing is going to react with strong opposition. China has consistently maintained its adherence to the One China principle. It has always stressed that the Taiwan issue is an internal matter and that it will not tolerate interference by any third party. And in particular, Taiwan has been defined by China as the core of its core interests. So from Beijing's perspective, Prime Minister Takaichi's remarks are highly provocative. And because of this, in response, China has stepped up pressure on Japan through economic and cultural retaliatory measures. You mentioned like the tourists, visiting and things like that. But now this has also then rapidly escalated tensions as well. So as a result of this, bilateral relations are increasingly moving beyond economic and diplomatic disputes and towards the risk of genuine and increasingly confrontational military tension.
Definitely. So when we speak about military tensions, we hear that Japan has accused China's fighter jet of locking its radar into a Japanese aircraft. And China, for its part, says this hasn't happened. Professor Conley, so given the lack of solid military communication channels between the two, how likely is an accidental military crash, which everyone's concerned about?
Well, absolutely. There's always a very real risk of accidental escalation when you have military forces from two rival countries operating in very close environment. And let's remember the context of this most recent encounter. The Chinese aircraft carrier group was doing takeoff and landing exercises, which for an aircraft carrier is the most vulnerable you can be. And there were Japanese aircraft shadowing it. And this is when allegedly the Chinese fighters turned on their radar. This is a very dangerous act, of course, if it happened, because the next step would be firing missiles, the radar-guided missiles. And this meant that there's a very high risk of miscalculation, maybe someone fearing that someone's going to shoot first, so they want to fire first. Now, while I doubt that the pilots on either side are likely to deliberately take a shot, both militaries, are relatively well trained. They do have discipline, but it is very possible for a miscalculation, an error, or a mechanical breakdown. For example, imagine if one of those Japanese F-15s accidentally crashed shortly after the Chinese radar was turned on. What would have happened then? And it's not an impossible scenario. In October of this year, an American F-18 and a helicopter operating from the US Nimitz crashed within 30 minutes of each other in the South China Sea. Probably it was contaminated fuel, which caused both of these aircraft to crash. But imagine if this had occurred in a standoff with Chinese ships and aircraft, it could have really escalated out of control.
Definitely. So just a little, very small misstep without a hotline could even escalate the situation very quickly. Now, we've been saying that Beijing has responded with a series of retaliatory measures, including a travel advisory for Japan, canceling Japanese concerts, and more. Professor Kim, what is the end game we're expecting here for China? Is it hoping to force a shift in Japan's stance on Taiwan?
I think there might be several strategic objectives behind China's kind of across the board retaliatory measures against Japan. First, by increasing political and economic costs within Japan, Beijing appears to be trying to encourage the Japanese government to adopt a more cautious approach to the Taiwan issue in the future. So it almost seems like a soft warning in a way. But also, and at the same time, China seems intent on generating domestic pressures within Japan by imposing economic, cultural, and travel-related penalties. The decline in Chinese tourism, the cancellation of cultural events, and various forms of trade or export restrictions directly affect Japan's business community and cultural sector. And this potentially creates constituencies that favor a softer policy stance as well. And also, China's pairing these measures with signals of military tension and warning. So this goes beyond the mere expression of diplomatic dissatisfaction. And by doing this, Beijing may be aiming to demonstrate its resolve and leverage not only towards Japan, but it may also be sending a broader message or a broader strategic message to other countries as well. Those with the intention of and it's kind of discouraging other countries from intervening in the Taiwan issue. So in many ways, China's kind of sending a warning, not just to Japan, but everyone else about the Taiwan issue. And so ultimately, these actions are serving a strategic signaling purpose. China's showing both regional audiences as well as domestic audience and foreign governments as well that Beijing treats perceived challenges on core interests like Taiwan very seriously and is ready to apply pressure in a multidimensional way, whether it's economic, political, and many other ways.
So clearly, we're really seeing a stern response from China over there. And over in Japan, some people have already expressed concern about this escalating situation and also about the economic toll of this diplomatic fallout. But yet, Prime Minister Takaichi shows really no sign of walking back on her statements. Professor Connolly, what do you think is the strategic calculation behind the Japanese Prime Minister's decision?
Yeah, and as they say, right, international relations is always a two-level game. You have the international relations and then you have the domestic politics. And I think in essence, what she's doing here is she's sacrificing the relationship with China for, I think, a strong element of domestic agendas. And I would say in maybe ranked order, the first is simply strengthening her coalition. There was a poll this week suggesting that the anti-China stance is relatively popular in Japan. Definitely her kind of far-right coalition partners, the Innovation Party, they support her stance. I think more fundamentally, though, it also serves some policy agendas. She has this kind of desire to remilitarize Japan. She has before said she wants to repeal Article 9. And I think by provoking China into this very militarized, very aggressive response, she may be able to justify more military spending, more of an aggressive Japanese stance in the future. And in this regard, maybe a more hostile China is definitely a heavy domestic price for Japan to pay, but it may help her domestic policy agendas in the future. And maybe the third factor could be the U.S. alliance. Traditionally, the U.S. has always encouraged its East Asian allies to take a more stronger stance against China, and Japan is very much doing so right now. But in this case, perhaps she miscalculated a little because the US reaction was initially a little colder, maybe, than Japanese policymakers thought.
Right. In fact, lately we just saw yesterday that the White House has actually avoided direct mention, and it said that it maintains good relations with both countries. In fact, Professor Kim, how should we interpret the stance by Washington? And do you think Washington's cautious approach could be a variable in how this conflict would unfold?
Yes, as you mentioned, right now the White House has refrained from taking an explicit position on the tensions between China and Japan. And Professor Connolly mentioned that, in the past this was slightly different, but in this case, now we're seeing the U.S. stance shift a little bit. Right now, the U.S. has reiterated a general stance that it maintains good relations with both countries, and it's likely that this reflects a strategic calculation by the U.S. government, because on the one hand, the U.S. is emphasizing its alliance with Japan, but at the same time, the U.S. is seeking to preserve a pragmatic and stable relationship with China. So for Washington, the alliance with Japan remains critically important, but maintaining stability in U.S.-China relations has become increasingly salient in light of the recent contacts between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, and this is also affecting ongoing trade negotiations as well. And so we have seen the U.S.-China relationship quite strained within the past few years, even starting from the first Trump admin term. And so in this sense, the U.S. posture can be interpreted as a form of what we would describe as balancing diplomacy. It's designated to reassure allies while avoiding an unnecessary escalation of tensions with Beijing. But that being said, from Japan's perspective, the absence of this strong and explicit public support from Washington, especially when it's combined with what many perceive as U.S. diplomatic entrenchment in Europe and the Middle East, this is very likely to deepen doubts about the credibility of America's security commitments. And on a side note, this may also affect South Korea as well, because Korea occupies a geopolitically similar position to Japan. And so Korea may also begin to harbor greater skepticism regarding the reliability of U.S. security assurances. So in many ways, this is affecting a lot of different countries.
Right, definitely. So it's very intertwined and it's connected, and we have to focus on each country's national interests. But as Professor Kim has mentioned, Professor Connolly, how do you foresee this impact of this standoff in the broader security landscape in Northeast Asia?
Well, definitely in the short term, there's going to be an elevated risk of military clashes. And even though the missile lock-on incident happened on the weekend, throughout this week, actually, as the Chinese aircraft carrier group was sailing past, we saw a lot of Japanese military activity, including flights of aircraft armed with anti-ship missiles. This is quite unprecedented sorts of activities going on. We've had Russian and Chinese bombers flying patrols, including into South Korea's ADIZ. And just yesterday, U.S. nuclear-capable B-52 bombers made a flight with Japanese fighter planes, maybe a belated show of support. So in the short term, with all of these different military aircraft and ships, there's certainly an elevated risk. Long term, I think we need to maybe go back to what Professor Kim said about the importance of Taiwan to China. I think what China's doing right here is demonstrating its commitment, its red lines, and it really, I think, forces policymakers in Seoul and Tokyo and other countries in the region that when we talk about Taiwan, we may be talking about war with China. And I think it's something that we need to take more seriously. In the past, there was a lot of attempts to talk about the cross-straits issue without imagining a conflict with China. But I think this incident really shows China showing that, no, it is a high risk like that. At the same time, there's greater questions about U.S. support in the region. And the recent release of the U.S. National Security Strategy, it does emphasize Asia more, but it also raises this fear that the United States may do exactly what it did in Europe, right? It promoted Ukraine throughout much of the 2000s, and now suddenly it appears to be abandoning them. So I think a bleaker, more realist world is the lesson of this crisis.
Right, definitely, since we're seeing a lot of tensions both on the air and in the waters as well. It's quite a tough situation for South Korea as well. President Lee Jae Myung, he's considering state visits to both China and Japan in the year 2026. And amid this volatile situation, Professor Kim, what kind of practical diplomatic path do you think should South Korea take?
Yeah, in many ways, South Korea is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with this. As tensions between China and Japan continue to escalate into the military and security realm, South Korea is very likely or more likely to pursue a pragmatic diplomatic approach rather than actively positioning itself as a mediator. But there are clear structural limitations to Seoul playing a full-fledged mediating role here. The Taiwan issue and the China-Japan dispute are deeply embedded in U.S.-China strategic competition. It's also deeply embedded in the U.S.-Japan alliance, as well as China's core interests. So this leaves South Korea with only limited leverage to shape outcomes. And an overly ambitious attempt at mediation could, in fact, increase South Korea's diplomatic burdens rather than reduce them. So it could make things a lot worse. And it's very likely that President Lee Jae Myung is well aware of these constraints. So as a result of this, I believe it's more probable that Seoul will refrain from pushing itself into a mediator role and instead maintain a principled stance that calls for restraint and de-escalation, but doing this without directly intervening in China-Japan relations.
A cautious stance is very crucial, it seems as though, for South Korea, especially since we're expecting a South Korea-Japan summit around January next year. But lately, Prime Minister Takaichi reignited controversy by asserting Japan's sovereignty over the Dokdo Islands. Professor Connolly, do you see that claim as a move that's aimed at domestic politics, or it's more of a deliberate diplomatic signal to Korea?
I think it's a little bit of both. Definitely, she scores points with a lot of her domestic right-wing supporters when she says this. But I would suggest that Japan does make a practice of this. And in the world of social media, right, we're used to this term rage bait, where you post something on social media that you know is going to get a lot of angry comments. Well, in the diplomatic world, there's a very similar strategy. You provoke a country, hope they overreact. And if they overreact too much, they look irrational and you look like a victim. And traditionally, Japan has always been able to provoke Korea by raising the Dokdo issue. And I would say maybe this whole crisis over Taiwan would be a very similar example of Japan doing this, but the reaction was much greater than they expected. And Dokdo with South Korea is a bit of a safer button to push for the Japanese Prime Minister. But I would also suggest that it could be a negotiating move. So, for example, if she provokes the Dokdo issue now, then at the summit, if she doesn't, it's seen as a concession. But if she never raised the Dokdo issue at all, then to make a signal, a concession, she would have to do something much more substantial. So by talking about Dokdo now, she might be able to be more gracious at the actual summit.
A very interesting point. So it could be a strategic move from the Japanese Prime Minister. What about Professor Kim? Do you agree on this? And of course, South Korea's presidential office quickly issued a strong rebuttal of this. Do you think there's still room for both sides to push forward while managing their differences?
I completely agree with Professor Connolly. This is a really strategic move. It's also, not just appealing to the domestic audience, but Prime Minister Takaichi is going to be able to utilize this in many ways. And, in many ways, it does seem like the rage bait kind of situation. She knows that these kinds of remarks are going to be, it's going to create a huge reaction from South Korea. And, any remark regarding Dokdo is, it brings up one of the most sensitive historical and sovereignty issues in South Korea-Japan relations. It brings it back to the forefront. So As a result of this, as you mentioned, the presidential's office swift and forceful response was in many ways domestically almost unavoidable. Issues of this nature leave little room for compromise on either side. So in the short term, they are likely to cast a shadow over the atmosphere surrounding the upcoming summit. As Professor Connolly mentioned, if the prime minister doesn't bring this up, then it can look good for her as well. But that being said, it would be an overstatement to argue that this issue alone could derail the summit altogether. Both Seoul and Tokyo are acutely aware of the need to manage their bilateral relationship in the current international environment. This is the current international environment, which is marked by intensifying US-China strategic competition, the North Korean problem, and broader regional security uncertainties. So the key question is whether both sides can avoid amplifying the issue and succeed in controlling the actual agenda. And to put this in other words, while Prime Minister Takaishi's comments clearly constitute a negative variable for Korea, there still remains room on both sides to move the relationship forward if strategic considerations take precedence. So ultimately, the success of the summit will depend less on reaffirmed principled positions than on how effectively both governments can contain and manage their differences.
So we'll have to see on the atmosphere of how the summit would unfold. Now, when we look long term, then Professor Connolly, if we want to see a stable recovery and trilateral ties between South Korea, China, and Japan, what do you think are possible concrete trust building steps?
Well, I think the first thing could be, and this is maybe building on what Professor Kim said earlier, is not doing anything, right? In terms of if South Korea tries to too aggressively put itself forward as a problem solver, it might alienate both sides. Maybe sometimes breaking the cycle of provocations means not overreacting, maybe focusing on other issues that are not so sensitive. And I think certainly President Lee's whole agenda of pragmatic diplomacy, focusing on AI, aging populations, facilitating trade, these are all areas where all three countries have vested interests. And this could be, I think, in the short term, a more fruitful avenue to pursue. More long term, in terms of the security situation in the region, I do think Northeast Asia needs something similar to the Cold War era Incidents at Sea Agreement. And this was an agreement signed between the USSR and the United States in 1972. And it basically created basic guidelines for Soviet and US aircraft and ships, how they should behave when they're close to each other to avoid accidents or miscalculations. And I think what we saw this week, lots of military forces operating in close proximity. And South Korea is guilty of this behavior as well. Let's not forget back in 2018, a South Korean warship turned on its radar on a Japanese surveillance plane. And in 2019, South Korean fighter jets fired hundreds of warning shots at a Russian plane over Dokdo. So I think all countries in the region are guilty of sometimes excessive behavior. And if South Korea took the lead in committing itself to the guidelines of an incidents at sea kind of agreement, maybe it could help establish a pattern of responsible behavior in the region and prevent similar situations from occurring. Even though we can't agree on the big strategic issues, we can at least set some basic guidelines for ships and aircraft, how to behave in a civilized fashion.
A very good reminder for us, Professor Connolly. We'll really have to see how South Korea could navigate this tense moment under President Lee's pragmatic diplomatic policy. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Connolly.
My pleasure.
And of course, Professor Kim, for your time and for your insights tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.